Welcome. My name is Richard Serrano, and I am chairing this session, Mentoring Beyond the Classroom, the Continuing Relationship Over Time. I'm pleased to welcome you to this CAA's Services to Artists Committee program. SAC sessions are free and open to the public and provide opportunities for the creative exchange of ideas. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. In this virtual space, I invite you to add into the chat the ancestral lands you are currently standing on. We thank them for their stewardship of the land. While you most likely are not new to Zoom, I wanted to point out that captioning is available for this session. Simply click on the CC box at the bottom of your screen. Please keep your audios on mute during the discussion. We will have time for questions at the end. You can also place your questions into the chat. I am proud to chair this panel that includes a discussion on mentoring between two Chicago-based artists. For introductions, I will now turn the microphone over to Cesario Moreno, Director of Vision Chief Curator of the National Museum of Mexico, located in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood.
Bienvenidos, buenos días. Welcome to the National Museum of Mexican Art. We are coming to you live from the Chicago Gallery. It's a space where we focus on our local talent, our local artists. Today we have two artists having a conversation, and both of them are from the Chicagoland area. Two different neighborhoods originally, two different generations. They are two abstract artists. Dan Ramirez, who had a solo exhibition here back 6 years ago, I think, in 2016. And we're coming to you live here from Ruben Aguirre's exhibition, Tectonic Reflections. It will be here for the rest of this summer. So we welcome anybody in Chicago to please come and see it. And now we're going to join both artists as they have a conversation about something very important in the arts, mentorship and inspiration. Welcome.
Ruben, well, we've been invited here this morning and into this terrific exhibition we've kind of managed to put together and been asked to and been given an opportunity to talk a little bit about a situation that in many ways has developed, I think, between you and myself, which is the idea of mentorship. And given the time we have, we've had to spend together and talk a little bit about that, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on that. How would you define the idea of a mentorship situation regarding, what we've been up to or what you've seen in general?
Yeah, good question. And thank you for your help and your role in curating the show. It's been a learning experience for me because it's my first museum show. So, I'm always learning and observing and taking into consideration, your thoughts and Cesario and everyone else. So thank you for that. In the bigger picture, the idea of mentorship, I think, for me has changed a lot over time, and the people who have filled those roles for me have also changed. And it comes from different places, I think. But I think the bottom line is people who can kind of help guide you along the way, and who are willing to be honest with you and give you sincere feedback, criticism. Just help foster a relationship, which is what it really is. And I think sometimes that can be a one-on-one relationship, and I think sometimes it's a communal relationship too. So I think it continues to evolve, at least for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. In terms of, as you put it, as a communal relationship, given the fact that you're also a muralist, you work outdoors as well as this wonderful exhibition we have indoors this evening or this morning. So you have these opportunities to not only find yourself in a situation where you're inviting people into a more intimate space such as we're in today, but that you're also involved in the larger scope of the environment when you're outside. And I'm interested in that. As we're both fellow artists, we're both Chicago natives, and we've had an opportunity to work in Chicago, see a lot of other artists, our colleagues who've been out here and who we've been inspired by. I know I'm in my own situation where I've had outside mentors, people that I still talk with, who I'm constantly in conversation with and have an opportunity to discuss who I am, what I feel like, which is for me quite different than what I remember experiencing as someone who was teaching back in the universities, where the systems are such where you're dealing with students who don't have the same experience as someone who has gathered some experience over years. They've been out and they've had a different kind of relationship with other colleagues of their own or other artists of their own. And there's kind of an intimacy that takes place between two people. Now, you and I have had a chance to, over time, we haven't known each other for a long time. Sure. I've known your work for a number of years, having been working here in Chicago as a practicing artist, and admired the kinds of things that you do. So we never really had a chance to talk. But recently, given the fact that I was invited to be a curator for this particular exhibition, we did have a chance to sit down and talk. And it's always been interesting that the mentorship has always been kind of looked at least as I've understood it through the years, as giving advice. Mm-hmm. And so when you come into someone's studio, for example, in the way that I came into your studio, we talked about, how we would look at the exhibition and so forth. Giving advice on the basis of what my own experiences might have been could be so different than what your experience has been, and how we begin to kind of like shake hands in a particular kind of way as to what is it you want to say? What is it that I want to say? How do we kind of relate to one another in terms of what do I want as someone who might be curious about how I want to look at the work that you're involved in, and kind of reflecting back on my own experiences of my own mentors who've given me a lot of advice, and thinking back when they gave me this advice after I was out of school, after I wasn't a student at a particular point in time, that the advice is different. The approach is different. That it's not a student faculty kind of a relationship, so to speak, if we're talking about the educational system, but it's two friends, it's two people talking, and the idea of mentor is kind of always interesting. It's almost like there's a little bit of a hierarchy of one kind or another. Sure. Which I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? Like when you and I first kind of like got together, we had a chance to talk.
Yeah, so let me back up really quick. When I first started really getting into art making, which would have been in high school, my introduction to that was through graffiti, and that practice at that time was very much a mentor-mentee kind of relationship, because this was before the internet. So if you were going to learn about what kind of paint to use and what kind of caps to use, like someone had to teach you those things. That information wasn't available anywhere. So at the age of 14, I was already like learning from one friend. I had one friend who really taught me a lot about how to look at graffiti, which would later on play a big role in how I look at public space. So I would say that was the first real mentor that I had. And this was someone who's the same age as me, but had a lot more experience in painting. And so that would have been the first layer. But and as time went on, there was the student teacher relationship in college, and peer-to-peer relationship again after college. And then fast forward to you and I talking in the studio, is like an entire evolution, I would say, of mentorship roles that I've had. And there's a lot that I could say about all those stages, but going back to your question about you and I in the studio, it's I want to I want to be open-minded to anything that anyone has to say, really. And I respect your art, and I followed your art long before we met. And I think it's always interesting to hear a perspective of your art from someone who doesn't have that same upbringing as you or as me. So there's a value in that, right? Because at the end of the day, our art is communicating things, and some things will get communicated and some things may not. And to kind of have the ability to like stop and talk about that and see what kind of visual information is like circulating between the two of us coming from two different places. I value that a lot. So the fact that we were able to make that happen means a lot to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's nevertheless, I mean, you kind of phrase that in a way that I think is really important, in that as I began to kind of like attempt to try to articulate earlier, there is this kind of relationship where we're shaking hands and we're being friends, so to speak, and we're learning about each other. But there's a certain experience, I think, like when I had my mentors, I recognize, of course, as you pointed out, that there's an experience they have that I didn't have at that particular point in time, given where I was at as an artist and as a student. For example, if it was during my student stages. But there was always something that there were certain expectations on my part as a young person, that not only was this a person who had more experience than I did and could give me advice and mentor me, but how did I want to be mentored? It was really kind of important. Mm-hmm. And I remember on a more intimate level at one point in time, there was a certain kind of a assumption about the kind of work that I did, for example. And so when I would talk to my mentor about the kind of work I was doing, I found myself in a context where my mentor really wasn't aware of a certain situation that had to deal with what I would have considered a problem at the time, which was like an identity kind of thing I was going through at a particular point in time. And my mentor had absolutely no relationship between that kind of identity or, other than an art experience out of the context of the identity, but just the big art experience. And I began to understand the mentorship more in terms of there's a point at which your mentor has an experience, can offer that experience on that general level, but them trying to understand and get into who you are as a person seemed to me to be very important. It seemed to be like, at what point does my mentor understand my voice, so to speak? Or how do I understand my voice? And what role can a mentor play in that? And I used to ask myself if maybe that was just simply too much to ask of a mentor. How far can a mentor, reach into someone's background and begin to really identify at that point? And so there seems to be this kind of split for me where, on a more practical and more pragmatic sense, your mentor can offer you the kind of advice that can be very helpful in terms of the more pragmatic ways one approaches getting a show at a gallery and so forth. But how far can they get into who are you as an artist? Should there be that kind of relationship between a mentor, or is that something that's maybe too much to ask?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, are there boundaries to mentorship? I can only speak from my experience, but I feel like there have been kind of separate roles, whereas, there are things I want to learn and feedback I want to get that pertains more to my art. And there are also life situations that I may need guidance with that may involve more about who I am and what's better for me as a person. And I think it's hard to expect one person to be able to grasp all of that. So I think for me, it's worked out where I have a group of peers that know me pretty well, that have they've seen my progression as an artist, and they know where I started and what I've gone through. And, I know I can turn to that community for certain things. But the mentorship that I get from someone like you or another artist or someone who's coming from a different perspective, I feel like there's a value in that experience that I was just not going to find anywhere else. And I think that's why that's important. I you know, and at different points in my life, I would have projected what a mentor-mentee relationship should be, like you touched on. And I think, you know, on one hand, that's natural for a growing artist who's finding their way to like question everything. But, you know, at this point at my life, I feel mature enough where I can kind of relax and kind of see what's there. I mean, the bottom line again is kind of developing relationships. So I try to approach that open-mindedly, you know, and see where people can connect, what we can expand on, what we have in common, and also how we challenge each other, because that's a part of it too, right? That's like the harder part of being a mentee, is like hearing someone else's advice to you, or saying, you know, maybe try this other thing, and that may not really resonate with you. So, you know, challenging yourself to think differently is hard.
Well, let me back up also just a little bit. It's something I referred to a moment ago. And that is that the difference between the more general kind of advice you can get from a mentor, and opposed to, let's say, something like, you and I both come from a background where we have an ethnicity that we can share. How important do you think that might be?
That's a good question. I think that's a really complex question, for a few reasons. You know, I think the fact that we come from different generations, that identity piece affects us differently, and it's going to affect our art differently. So, you know, I think it could be different for any combination of two people having a conversation.
Yeah, I think you struck on something really important there, and that was that we come from two different generations. I think that has a lot to do with the kind of mentor and mentorship one might receive, in terms of what one might expect, in terms of what they can receive from their mentors. Again, referring back to something I had mentioned earlier, I know that a couple of my mentors were very helpful in terms of my being able to acquire a certain kind of exposure and introduction into furthering my education, let's say, by giving me advice on how to write grants, how to do the kinds of things that would allow me to grow more within the educational system to begin with, before stepping out into the larger world that they've already been in, or they may be teachers themselves who are giving me this kind of advice. And maybe that's another question too. Does one necessarily have to be in the area of the arts, so to speak, to be a good mentor? Should they have the same kind of experience? Let's say you're a painter. Should they be a painter as well? Or what does it really take for someone to come up to you and sit with you, or for someone to come to me and sit with me and talk with me, that's going to make me walk away from that experience, either on that particular day, let's say, and I can say to myself, well, I'm going to go back in my studio and I really want to work today. I'm really kind of fired up because some things have really been, brought up to me today that give me some options that maybe I didn't have before.
That's a good question. I think it's important to have people around you, whether they're mentors or peers that are not also artists, to get like a more rounded perspective on things, because the reality is that you and I can sit and talk about painting and what we should do for the next moves of our careers and stuff like that, and that's valuable, but we're still people. We have lives, and like our physical health, our mental health, and things like that. That's all part of it. So we can't just only look at this one area and receive mentorship in that one area, right? I mean, you can, and I'm sure a lot of young people do, but we have to feed the whole thing, right?
Yeah, I guess one of the thoughts that's going through my mind as we're talking here is, at what point, if any, does there have to be a distinction between what a mentor is? It's written down in a book somewhere.
Sure.
A mentor is this. And where you're talking and saying, and you mentioned something about other areas, talk about other areas other than art. I know from my own experiences, I talk to musicians, I talk to people who aren't musicians at all, but are simply museum goers, who I find myself sometimes giving me the kind of advice I would never have maybe gotten from a mentor, yet that's still taking place. But so, I ask myself, is it really important to make that distinction? What is a mentor, and what does a mentor really mean? I looked it up in the dictionary. I thought,
Okay.
I think I'll look it up in the dictionary before we started this morning. And basically it said was, we give advice. Wow. Okay. Mentors give advice. Well, I have a lot of advice I can give in a lot of different areas, and some of which may be helpful, some of which may not be helpful. But I'm beginning maybe to think that there's this kind of like a little bit of a necessary component that might substitute as a little bit of a leash. That is, and this is from the point of view of someone who's very young, just coming into being educated, and since we're talking about art, in the art system, to know that there is somebody out there that eventually can be helpful in ways that you're not able to do while you're working in a more intimate area in the studio, where you're working with your faculty and larger groups of people. But there's that one or two persons out there. I know that was certainly my experience when I was younger, as a younger artist. I was older when I went to school. I was in my early 30s when I first really began in the art school. But I knew that there were people out there with some experiences that could help me. Mm-hmm. And I knew them. I didn't know them in the context of the physical context of the school I was working at. They were outside of that, and I got to meet them, and they became friends. Okay. Who became mentors, who helped me forever, and still to this day are my mentors. I look at them and I say they're my mentors. And so I've asked myself, like, well, what does a mentor actually mean? Aren't they only just my friends? But apparently there is this experience, there is this kind of longevity of your mentor being exposed to areas of where they've been engaged in having to make the kinds of decisions that they've had to make in the past, that they feel is fruitful to bring to someone that they're talking to, who they really care a lot about, and that they feel is a person who wants to absorb this kind of thing. So when you think of a mentorship, on the one hand, that mentor, how that mentor looks at the person they're going to be the mentor for, seems to me, as at least my experience has been, as becoming friends, or if you will, mentors to other people, that what is indicated back to me, what I'm getting from that other person, because the mentor, not unlike, I think, a teacher or a faculty member who's conducting a class, is getting as much from the person that they're talking to. My mentors have certainly explained to me at times, or at least mentioned to me at times, that they grew as well, talking with me as I did with them. And again, we go out to galleries, we meet our friends in the galleries, and we get involved in conversations, and we find ourselves sometimes our mentors at that end of the room. Mm-hmm. And I'll go over and talk with my mentor. There is this something very, very special that's taking place that doesn't ordinarily happen with just a friend. So I guess what I'm sure. Starting to do here as we're talking is, I am on the one hand trying to bring this all together as we're all one, but there really is something a little bit different and a little bit special about how that mentor interacts with me, or with how I might interact with someone if I'm supposedly mentoring them. And like, do I come up to you and say, I want to be your mentor? Well, it's kind of like saying, I have a lot of advice that I could really help you with. And that's not a bad thing. Right. That's not a bad thing at all. And, I think, again, I keep thinking about your activity as a muralist. I really admire the idea, and I'm not a muralist. I've never had the opportunity to work outside in the environment in such a way where I can interact with other muralists, let's say. Have you had an experience where there are just muralists, let's say, per se, that you find yourself attracted to as someone who might be really a mentor? I mean, would you be seeking out a certain kind of identification for a mentor?
I haven't actively sought it out, but when I was in college, and this was a time that I was doing a lot of graffiti, and I was also in school, and that's when I met Mario Castillo, who was my professor at Columbia, and that I would say was another stage, another mentor that entered my life. And at that time, you know, I kept those two parts of my art making very separate. Graffiti was something I did with friends on the side. I didn't tell everybody about that. And then I was go to school and I was trying to be an artist. And, you know, I brought my portfolio with my graffiti to class one day and I showed him, and his response was different than any other adult at that time that had seen my work. And he was immediately encouraging and had some knowledge of what I was doing, but he was not immersed in that culture. And but just the fact that he, you know, looked at it, critiqued it, we had a conversation about it, and this was in front of a class, and you know, we had a conversation about this kind of work because a lot of people didn't see that kind of work at the time. That one instance alone, I think, really helped me feel comfortable with, you know, being vulnerable, I guess. And I was so used to my work being kind of a secret, like I only share that with certain people, you know. And I think that can happen in really in any art practice. But you know, to have someone to encourage and to encourage objectively, you know, without trying to give too much advice, I guess, you know, to have someone who understands what you're trying to do and can maybe say, hey, you know, I see what you're doing. Why don't you look at this? Or why don't you think about this? Yeah. Just keep it in mind. You know, I think that was very powerful, and I never had that before.
Yeah, well, that's a good example, I think, of actually what kind of transpired between you and I, and in fact, Cesario. Cesario had approached me about the fact that you were possibly going to be having a show, which of course has transpired. I, as an artist who's not a muralist, you were having a show that was much more intimate in terms of the kind of work you were doing in the studio, although it may relate to the kinds of things and the way you think about dealing with murals. We were pretty much confined to what's this going to be like as a intimate studio experience that we can bring to your viewers, to your audience here at the Mexican Museum. And so getting back again to being able to identify how mentorship works in regards to whether one needs to have the same experience or not. I think the fact that, as you point out, that you had someone who could deal with your work as a muralist in a way that there was the kind of experience that you would expect someone to have, more so than someone who wasn't a muralist. In the opposite way, the adverse way, worked for us, because I'm someone who worked primarily in the studio. And so when we looked at your work and we look at your work here in the way that the installation took place, we can then begin to take that kind of experience that we're talking about, which a mentorship, I think, really finally defines itself as.
Yes.
Bringing that experience that's really going to solidify in some way all the sharp little edges that will make it more consistent with the kind of work that's being shown, or the kind of work that's being done, that the mentor then has a real responsibility towards keeping that context in play. I'm not going to, for example, I wouldn't be the person to deal with your work out on a brick wall, as much as I might like to think, well, I think I would know how to, you know, I think I have some pretty good advice. I have a lot to say about how you might want to do that brick. I might like a lot to say how I might work around that corner. The fact of the matter is I don't. I don't have that. I admire it because I've seen it, but I don't have that. So that mentorship really does become a kind of really defined, it's almost a defined, it's not a defined experience because we all like to think of ourselves being able to move outside of these things, but it certainly has, it does keep you in context. It keeps your and my relationship in the context of the work itself. You and I may talk a lot about our identity, which we have. We've talked about on our own personal situations, how we view ourselves as artists, as Mexican-American artists, if you will, and what that experience means to us. So we share that and that's kind of what a mentorship does. So we both have that, and that's where we both become mentors for each other, because we both have these different kinds of experiences that we're able to share and talk. We talked a little earlier when we were talking about this prior to when we started our conversation this morning. I had mentioned something about my conversation with Gomez, with Sergio, and had the opportunity to talk with Sergio, and we had this in common. We could deal with that, and it was intimate, and it was within the context of what we both understood. And so that, in a large part, is where I think that mentorship is really, really significant as something really in and of itself. It does, it defines itself in that way. And, you know, it's like when I was mentioning earlier, you know, we're in the galleries, we walk into people that we know. How much does your experience, what you've been able to experience outside of a mentorship, just if the community at large, going to galleries, doing things of that nature, how much is that in comparison to a mentorship, let's say? How would you separate those two things, and how both helped you in whichever ways they may have helped you?
Yeah, I think with making public work, you know, work that exists in the public sphere, like you have to have an open conversation with people. You can't just have a you know, tunnel vision. I mean, you can, and there's work that does that, and I think graffiti does that quite a bit. But the thing that makes public art and mural painting more powerful, I think, is the fact that there is an open dialogue with people. So those conversations are important, you know, and those are conversations with people who probably don't have much to any art history knowledge or anything like that. And I think their opinions are still totally valid. So that's one aspect. I think, you know, I enjoy going to galleries, or I did before the pandemic. And you know, that's a good place to look at art and kind of step out of your own bubble for a bit and kind of, you know, tune into what other people are doing and have conversations with your peers about, you know, what you really like, what you think you would be better, and those kind of things. And, you know, all those things are kind of floating in my mind, and I kind of relate them back to me in some way at some point. Maybe it's the next Monday when I'm at the studio, kind of like reflecting on those things. I think all that stuff is important. You know, it's really important to kind of engage in different groups of people just to get that feedback. And maybe it doesn't change the way you do things, but I think you have to consider it. You know, you can't, like, you have to be willing to hone in and make your art and do whatever it is you do, but you also have to, like, let those walls down. So, like, let other people in and kind of, you know, exist together.
I know if I can get back to my own experience in terms of mentorships, in terms of those who have mentored me, I know that over the years, and it's been over a course of almost 50 years, around about that span of time, as I've been able to develop a mentor that I would consider my mentor or mentors. And there aren't a lot. I mean, there are many faculty and many friends and art friends that I have that I've worked with over the years who have certainly influenced me and have helped me greatly. But there is that mentor. And I began to recognize myself as time had passed that there are 2-3 people that I actually think of as my mentor, who actually pointed out to me one time, "Oh, that's your mentor." Well, I never thought of, well, that's my mentor, but I'll be darned, it is my mentor. I'm always, Every time something comes up in my head that all of a sudden I feel a little problematic about, I really need advice. I
Sure.
really need advice. There is my mentor. I do go to my mentor for that advice. I'll either email that person, and I have 2 or 3 of them that I still do that with all the time.
Yeah, and even for me too, like when this show was coming together, you know, the selecting the word, the title, and all that stuff, you know, that I felt a little added pressure for figuring those things out. And I refer to a friend or two who are not artists, who I really value their opinion and their perspective. And I think it's important. It helps me kind of ground myself, because as an artist talking to other artists, I feel like we can kind of gravitate towards certain things and hover there maybe a little too long. And I really value having friends who understand art, who are not art makers, because they kind of help me get back to that baseline. And at the end of the day, I want to be able to communicate with anybody, not just people who understand this or that, right? And so I need mentors to help me do that too.
Yeah. I don't want to get into like really splitting up, you know, whether just a friend can be a mentor. I mean, as you're talking, I'm saying to myself, well, yeah, there's a lot of guys I play golf with. When I have problems with some of my things I'm doing in the studio, I find them more helpful than my mentor, so to speak. They give me better advice, because there really is a difference between someone who's actually had the experience as an artist, let's say, who's been a painter or a sculptor, or whatever the case may be. I mean, they really do have an experience that my golf buddy doesn't. You know, there's no question about that. So there is a distinction to be made, and it's not a slight one either. It's a big one. It's a big difference. There's no question about it. So I don't want to confuse the fact that a friend is just a mentor. That simply isn't the case. And at least that's not my opinion. And I don't gather that from our conversation as well. That mentorship is definitely, without question, very, very important. Finding good mentor, maybe good's not the right word, but finding that mentorship that you're comfortable with, finding that mentor out there, there's just a lot to be said for it. I am now, as I've gone up in age, and I'm at a point in my own life as an artist, especially as an artist, where I'm reaching certain decisions to be made. I have that mentor, and as recently as a few days ago, have been able to consort with that mentor, talk with that mentor about you know, where my life is at. And that's a mentor who's now that I think back on it, it's been my mentor for almost over 40 some years. So it's a big thing. It's a big thing. It's an important thing. And I think you know, certainly my advice as a former teacher of almost 25 years or so in the university system, I think young students should think about that. They should think about, you know, they have their faculty, they have the people that they work with, that there is someday, you know, that possibility that they may find themselves someone that they think, I can't find anybody I really need to talk to. There is somebody out there. There are mentors, and sometimes you have to approach those people. Let's say, be my mentor. Would you mind mentoring me? You know, and then they may look at me or us or whatever and say, well, I don't know, maybe you're, you know, maybe, you know, you just need some good advice. Yeah, that's just about it, isn't it? Yeah. So I mean, it's the kind of thing I certainly, you know, like, again, going back to when I first started, I was 32 years old when I went back to school. To think of a mentorship was like, I'm a big boy. I'm a big guy. I'm 32 years old now. I don't, you know, who I need a mentor. Yeah. Mentorship is really, really important. And that mentor could be younger or older than me. It really makes no difference. It's
So when you went back to school at 32, I mean, were you closed off to the idea of finding a mentor? Or was it something that you were seeking out?
I was so naive as someone. I was a former truck driver, 17 years hauling steel, going into art school because I was tired of hauling steel and wanting to be an artist. I wanted to be a cartoonist. I don't know if I even knew what the word, I don't think I knew what the word mentor, that it existed. It just wasn't part of my vocabulary. It wasn't the word that made any sense to me. I didn't know anything about it. But I certainly knew right away when I went, for example, I began at the University of Illinois, Chicago Circle campus. I met some people right away that I said to myself, oh, these are people I really want to know. These are people that are really interesting. And these are people that are offering me things that I never would have thought of ever in my lifetime. And so not using the word mentor, certainly as my life developed and things went on, my mentors all of a sudden kind of just blossomed before me. And I suppose because they showed an interest in something that I was interested in, and we found a rapport of one kind or another, whether it could have been eating pizza that we both liked, or whether it was the kind of art that we both liked, whatever the case may be, this was someone who was willing to share with me and take the chance to share with me, because they're offering me experience that they're assuming is going to be helpful. Otherwise, they wouldn't be offering it.
Right.
And so they're taking a chance as well.
Mhm.
And so that's to be appreciated, and has been, at least for me over the years. And my mentors are important. Yeah.
That's great.
And certainly the relationship that you and I have been able to form in watching your work grow over the years has been especially important, and especially rewarding. And this example here, right, that we're in today is one example of that.
Thanks. I appreciate you saying that. Honestly, if you would have told me that I'd be sitting here talking to you about my paintings, a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed that. So it means a lot that we are able to connect.
Yeah, well, I think we're actually, what we're saying is we're developing that. We're developing this kind of mentorship, if you will, in the big term mentorship, and that we're not afraid. We're not going to necessarily now like stand back and say, well, could I say this to this guy, or could I say that? I think we're finding ourselves kind of moving along in ways where, hey, what do you think? We were talking a little bit this morning, and I made a little comment that was a little bit critical about something that you had written, for example. And you're right there. It's like, well, you're listening. And I'm saying to myself, because you're listening, am I right? If I put this right, and so this is an exchange between you and I in that particular set of circumstances, as mentorshiping, if you will, goes, where we're being respectful of one another, respectful of what our needs are, our voice, what we're searching for. And I have to be especially respectful, since I've been invited and given the privilege to look at your work, who I haven't, on a personal level, as we're starting to attain now, never had prior to that, what we have now, that I have to really pay attention to what's happening, what's going on. Now it's all been put together.
So if I may, I love everything you were saying. And it sounds as though you're also talking about the mentorship as a relationship, right? It seems as though you're saying that the mentor needs to find interest, but the mentee needs to find trust. And those two things seem very important. We have a couple of questions that are coming up. And I think since I have the microphone here, I'll read it. We have a question about the last 2 years and the change and how it changed so many things. How did it inform, what was it? Last 2 years changed and informed your mentoring of others. How has the last 2 years changed the way that maybe you mentor other people or work with other people? Certainly that word mentor seems like it's so big, and it does have the idea of it being one way, but I love what both of you have said, that they're actually, it's a two-way street. Mentorship isn't just from the top down, as you said. But in the last 2 years, how do you think maybe it has changed? Ruby, do you want to take that first, and then Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton to say about it other than it was, living through the pandemic put a lot of strain on relationships as a whole. So, I mean, in relation to this show, our communication took a step back, and I think that goes for everyone. So, I think I'm sure we all handled it differently. I was still open, as I had been, but I think you know, being in a time and a place where you kind of rethink your priorities, you know, we all put those priorities in different places. So it was tricky for me. I wouldn't say it was easy. I think I felt like I was kind of holding my breath for a while. And I mean, I'm glad that we have, you know, I still have those people around me, and I've still been able to do that. We've still been able to pick up the conversation. But it was hard, you know, I'm not gonna lie, it was hard for me.
Yeah, I'm a kind of touchy-feely kind of guy. So the fact that we were kind of moved apart because of the pandemic, so to speak, like as so many of us have, you know, in the world today, that it was pretty anxious because I knew how important what was coming up for Ruben in terms of his work was to him, and that we couldn't share that kind of intimacy immediately, you know, one-on-one right away, that we'd have to find a way to Zoom this, we'd have to find a way to email this. And those things, they're just not the same. You know, it's like, that intimacy just isn't there. So there was kind of an anxiety for me in that respect, because I knew how much it meant to him. But by the same token, it meant as much to me, because if I'm going to be invited and be given the honor to be a part of his life, a very important part of his life, you know, to be separated in that way, began for me to make me, you know, understand and even recognize more and more, which was obvious around the entire country, around the world, that everybody is having this kind of problem. And, you know, how do we get by it? How do we get through this? Well, we do get through this. We're getting through it now in a lot of different ways in terms of more general scenario of the pandemic. But here we are, the show is up. Here we are, we've made schedules for talks, for other people to come. We've made schedules for an opening, and we're here today. So we get through it, we get beyond it, but the intimacy in mentoring is really important. It is. And you can get away with the emails and a lot of the other things where, like, for example, I think back in my own case where I've had a mentor for so many years that it's not as difficult. But when someone like Ruben, we're really meeting for the first time.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're really straight, we're really meeting for the first time, even though it's been a couple of years, it's really the first time where we're really having the time to engage. So we've gotten a lot done. So, and mentorship can do that. And so, you know, this entire venue here, I think, is one great example of that. Here's the outcome of that kind of a situation.
Yeah.
You know, another question or thought is, for there to be a relationship and a shared language and a discussion or conversation, much like the one that's happening here today, you have to share similar backgrounds or ideas, or at least be able to understand one another that way. What maybe is there in the city of Chicago that has perhaps influenced both of you in different ways? I mean, each one of you from different neighborhoods, from different experiences. Is there anything unique to this city that has allowed you to develop an art form and now, as two artists, be able to share an understanding? Is there anything, or would it have been the same if you were, say, from a rural area?
That's a good question.
Well, speaking for myself, as I mentioned earlier, you know, I come out of a background of 17 years of hauling steel. I didn't get into art school until I was 32 years old. So I immediately met some people right away, just by fiat, who were very much engaged in the art scene in Chicago, which allowed me then to be introduced to a lot of these other artists, and who became friends, who became colleagues, and all of this transpired. So I fed off of all of them. And I know as an abstract artist, a group of painters that I really began to focus on and became friends with a few of, and associated with socially, were the Chicago Images painters, who are totally the opposite of the kind of work that I did. But it was an opportunity for me to see the kind of energy, the kind of thing that was going on. And I would hear a lot of abstract artists, you know, that complain to me about, oh, it's always about the Chicago images. It's, oh, it's never, why isn't it ever about us? I said, well, because they're more interesting right now than we are. That's why. But yeah, the art community in Chicago, to me, has just been a real, you know, it's a bang, kind of like, just go for it, guy, and just deal with it, man. You know, it's there. You know, quit complaining. Do your thing. And this is the city of big shoulders, isn't that what we're kind of called, something like that? And we are. You know, this is a tough city, and the artists in it are tough. All of them are tough, and we do interesting things, and we have good art writing. We have terrific museums. Example, we're in one right now. So this is a city that you can afford financially. If I went to New York, I'd be a pauper. I'm almost a pauper as it is, but I mean, I'd really go in there. So that kind of thing, you know, certainly that would be my experience.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say about my experience that's specific to Chicago is that when I was really first falling in love with graffiti and seeing it everywhere, not long after that is when the graffiti blasters came in and everything was brown. This entire city was painted brown, everything, and it was so depressing to me. Not only the drabby color of brown being everywhere, but just the thought of like so much artwork and energy being covered up. That was like a really heavy thing to think about for me, and for a lot of people, I'm sure. But I eventually found that to be like the point of kind of inspiration for me to make more public work. It was like, okay, there's all these brown walls everywhere. Let me put something on there. So kind of just learning to think of that as an opportunity really kind of shaped me and kind of helped drive my public work. And I think that's very specific to Chicago.
We have another question that came through. How do you feel mentorship is especially important for BIPOC and or immigrant students? So specific to them.
I think, I mean, it's important to everyone, obviously. I think, but if you're coming from like another place, you know, then obviously you need like a little more guidance, and things need to be, you need help, you know. I mean, we all need help, and I guess we're saying like, do some people need more help than others? And yeah, that's true. Yeah. But I think it's really an individual case by case situation, right? I mean, it's not easy for anyone. So, you know, if you have another burden to carry and you have to find a place to live and things like that, or you're in an area that maybe isn't safe for you, then yeah, you've got more challenges to get your mentorship and to make your art. So, I mean, it can be very critical, you know, and I think, you know, we try to be in those places, right? I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I have to do with just everything Ruben just said there. I mean, that all that is integral into making the practical transformation into another society. You need all that help that he's talking about. And I think one other thing we could add to that I think is crucial, especially for an immigrant, so to speak, is the feeling of belonging. And when you have a mentor, you have that feeling of belonging. You know that there is someone who cares about you, and they care about you because you belong. You're not separated. You belong. And so the kind of advice that mentor will then approach that person with is usually going to feel like they care about me because I belong here like everybody else. And that's crucial, I think, especially for an immigrant.
And then maybe one more question. Thank you. One more question. So in the process of organizing and curating this exhibition, right? I mean, it's basically two artists working together to select work and figure out how to tell one of their stories. I would just like to hear a little bit about your maybe surprises, something you didn't expect, or the process overall. You know, we don't typically have artists curate, just like we don't typically have curators make artwork, right? So what about that in this context of advice and mentoring or that sort of relationship, two artists' relationship working together? Tell me a little bit, Ruben, as the artist whose work was being selected and you know curated, and then Dan as the person who was really helping to figure out how are we going to do this. If you could just explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier. You know, so if we had someone else curate this show, someone who was a muralist, you know, somebody like Maria Castillo, for example, you know, that would give one perspective to this show, and we would be talking about things that we both know about very well. But I think it's more fitting to have someone like Dan in here, because that kind of creates a bridge for me, right? That helps me understand a deeper perspective with Dan being a studio artist. So I think there's more for me to learn from that. And granted, there's a bigger distance for us to meet in the middle there. But I think that's the part, that's the work, right? That's the mentorship, that's the learning. At least from my perspective, you know, I need to have conversations. I need to hear about things that I haven't really talked about before. And everything about this exhibit, I think, falls in that category.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We touched a little bit on that already, in that I as a so-called helping putting the show together, helping curate the show, and playing a part of a mentorship, in the sense of being able to be very upfront and honest about what I think I want to see and what I think you know, what you're trying to accomplish, and giving you some advice on how I think we can kind of meld that all together. But I also have, and I'm not honest if I don't raise this as a situation for myself as a person. I have a thing as a Mexican-American artist who has dealt with identity from the different perspectives, beginning, not the least of which is that I was viewed as a minimalist artist, which from the stereotypical point of view, which drives me crazy, says like, wait, how could you do that? You're a Mexican artist. And I think one of the things, again, to be totally honest and upfront, that drew me to Ruben's work is that irregardless of the coloration of it, just the approach to it, the lyricism of it, of the kind that it was, and not that other Mexican-American artists or Mexican artists don't work like that, but it felt to me, I was more comfortable with, this is the kind of work that I love to keep exposing the public to. We're big. We do big things, all kinds of things. Here's a wonderful example of the kind of lyrical abstraction that you can just generally talk about as a lyrical abstraction that is so beautiful and so well done and so well thought about, and has so much behind it that we don't know about, that we can learn about. Come see it. This is special. So that's something for me that's always been an issue, as someone who's dealt, that's a personal thing about identity that I deal with on my own for myself. And so it's something that I tend to push more than I might push something else. That's a prejudice that I have and that I share with you.
That's a really good point, and I feel everything that you just said. I think I did feel comfortable as well when he said that you were going to curate the show. A certain level of just kind of like, oh, okay, cool. We're like I felt a little bit of safety there. Like, okay, I don't have to explain what I'm doing and who I am. Like, we kind of remove that piece, right? Like, we're able to remove this layer of like, we're both Mexican painters, which is important, but like, sure, let's put that to the side and allow for more room to talk about painting, right?
Exactly.
Wonderful. You know, there's one final question that came in. How has the mentorship you have received influenced how you may mentor others?
For me, I think the the one thing I learned from one of my first real mentors was to be observant, to be critical, and to be supportive. You know, you can do those things in very different ways, and to receive that from someone in a very positive way that's not judgmental. The first time that I received that from someone, that was a very new feeling for me, and that's how I knew that was a special relationship. And so I try to keep that in mind whenever I speak to someone who's younger, or a young artist, or anyone who asks for feedback. You know, I think for me, that was a powerful way of connecting with someone. So that's what I try to hold on to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could really add much to what Ruben just said. I couldn't agree more. Maybe the exception for me, given that I'm an older in age, a lot older in age, is that my first mentor, who I ultimately became the strongest mentor in my life, my first attitude, again, coming out of, I was 32 years old. This was somebody who was just about my age. It's like, oh, really? You know, it's like, you learn that, oh no, there is a difference between being a mentor and just being a friend. There really is. And it's taking into consideration some of the things you just said. They can talk to you in ways that you need to be talked to. They're honest and forthright with you, and they care about you, and you can feel that they care about you. And that pretty much, I think, says it all. And it's great value in that.
Well, thank you very much. I think this might end our panel discussion on mentorship with Dan Ramirez and Ruben Aguirre here at the National Museum of Mexican Art. Richard?
Yeah, I just want to thank the both of you, Dan and Ruben, for giving us this hour of your time. Ruben, your exhibition looks incredible. Hopefully I'll get to Chicago in the next couple of months to see it, but in the event that anybody watching is in Chicago, please definitely go and see the exhibition. And so thank you both for your time. And also thank you to the museum itself and Cesario and Jaime. I greatly appreciate all of the work that you did to bring us this panel. So for anyone else, Services to Artists Committee programming will continue. So please check out our website. And so thank you.